The story of Saudi Arabian football is the story of how to turn oil into football and success at football into political legitimacy. This is from David Goldblatt in his book, The Ball is Round, and it's a quote that I have struggled with. I believe almost everywhere somebody is kicking a ball with genuine passion behind it. It might be hiding behind the money, in the politics, in the fancy cars, but sport just demands emotional investment. Without that huge emotional investment, it can't survive. Now, I'm under no illusion that football or soccer is not political. It almost always is, particularly in the Middle East. But I just wanted to point out that I do believe there are many fans, many kids in Saudi Arabia that hold a genuine passion for the sport, for their club, and for their national team, before diving into a history that feels very artificial and calculated, using football and soccer as almost a means to an end. I also want to acknowledge that at the end of this video, many people will probably call me a sympathizer, either to the West or to Saudi Arabia, and that kind of comes with the territory. But it's important to not shy away from talking about these topics in an educated way. The more we do shy away from them, the more we just fall into whatever walled garden social media is presenting to us, which I realize is an ironic thing for me to say, a dude on social media. But now we've all been brought together because Saudi Arabia has injected itself straight into the heart of the sport that you love and I love too. So I've hired an academic researcher to help me put together the story of how football or soccer got to where it is today in Saudi Arabia. It is definitely time to tell that story. Now, Saudi Arabia's unique rise in the footballing world is probably due to its unique position. Despite the feeling that I often had that Saudi Arabia is old and mysterious and that its inner workings are more disconnected from the modern world than most Western countries, well, that's actually not true. The country and the power structure is relatively new. I promise this is important and will lead directly to Ronaldo ending up in Saudi Arabia, but a little history TLDR. The royal house of Saud, you might notice a little name similarity there. This is still the ruling house of Saudi Arabia. Well, they helped the British defeat the Ottoman Empire in World War I, and then spent the next 10 years consolidating power against other ruling families. And it is amazingly in that time that the first club was formed in Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia as it is now wasn't a thing. It's made even more amazing by the fact that the actual playing of football or soccer was illegal in what would become Saudi Arabia. But in the holy city of Mecca, it was the expat Indonesian population that submitted a request to local authorities to be able to play in 1927. They named the different teams after the towns that they played in, and very soon the locals got involved, even though it was technically illegal. It was clearly not something that was enforced on a broad scale. So they were playing football or soccer in Saudi Arabia before Saudi Arabia existed. A few years after the Indonesians started up their clubs around the holy city of Mecca in 1929, the House of Saud put down the last major rebellion in the Arabian Peninsula. They were actually working with the British to put the rebellion down, and it is wild that with their increased exposure to the British Empire, that they didn't legalize football or soccer in the Arabian Peninsula. That would actually take more than 20 years from 1929. But by 1932, the two kingdoms that were formed Saudi Arabia were united into one country, Saudi Arabia, and then just 6 years later, they found oil on the coast of the Persian Gulf. And while it took the Saudis until 1980 to buy back all of the rights to that oil from Aramco, which is an American company, because of course it is, the oil's existence overnight created massive wealth and international relevance that just didn't exist before 1938. The resulting social changes were understandably incredibly dramatic. We're talking about a country that now is one of the leading economic and political forces in the world, but 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, it was putting down a revolt against a bunch of dudes riding camels. Not just for fun, like they were riding them into battle less than 100 years ago. That's the underlying social context that will drive this story, and in 1951, the footballing soccer story starts properly because it's finally made legal in the kingdom. They immediately formed their first national team, an all-star team from some local leagues, to play against the Egyptian Ministry of Health. It would take a further 5 years for the Saudi Football Federation to officially be formed under Prince Abdullah bin Faisal Al Saud, who was the Minister of the Interior. This is the start of a trend that has not stopped to this day, and is important to understand, because Saudi Arabia is obviously an absolute monarchy. So the various enterprises within the country are operated often like personal fiefdoms. kingdoms, little kingdoms by the various members of the Saudi aristocracy. That's according to David Goldblatt, who you met earlier. This would ring true not just in the Football Federation, but in the very first official footballing competition that happened in Saudi Arabia, which was very subtly named the Prince Abdullah Al Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud Cup. That kicked off in 1951, and that is our friend, the Minister of the Interior. After the Football Federation was formed, the first actual national Saudi league was formed in 1957, but it was more of a tournament that you qualified for through your local league. So you do well in your local league, and then you go to the main national tournament. This was called the Saudi General Football League, and you were playing for what is called the King's Cup, which is something that is still contested. This is the equivalent of the English FA Cup today. It would take until 1975 for the first true national league to be formed in Saudi Arabia. That is not a long time ago. And it was delayed because King Faisal was assassinated, so they delayed the start of it until 1976. And with the start of this national league, an important template of Saudi society was reintroduced again. As in many areas of social and economic life in the kingdom, these organizations have been developed by employing short-term imported expert labor, working under the constant and inconsistent interventions of the Saudi aristocracy. That quote is obviously a telling prediction of where the Saudi League was headed. It was also an indication of how the Saudi League really started. Al Hilal won the first trophy after King Faisal's death in the National Saudi League, and their head coach was Englishman George Smith. In fact, only 4 of the 65 managers in Al Hilal's long and illustrious history were actually Saudi Arabian. This isn't inherently a bad thing, it just shows that the Saudi League has always been about importing expert labor, both players and coaches. By 1978, a ban on foreign players playing in the Saudi League was lifted. That's actually the same year that a similar ban was lifted in Europe, except the Saudi League had only been going on for freaking 2 years. Al Hilal immediately signed Roberto Rivellino, who won the World Cup with Pele in 1970 and had just recently played in the 1978 World Cup with Brazil as well. So the Saudi League from its very beginning has been signing some of the world's biggest superstars to play in the league. It has also demonstrated a real comfort in adjusting the way that the league is played, because in 1982 the league format changed again. This change was prompted to allow the national team to better qualify for the World Cup, which actually didn't work, but they brought twice as many teams into the top league, made it a 20-team top league that was then split into 2 groups. From the top of the 2 groups, there'd be a brief playoff. But like I said, this change didn't work and they didn't make the World Cup. They didn't make it in 1978 either, which was actually their first attempt to qualify for any major tournament. And if you're thinking, wait, Zealand, didn't they found a football federation in 1957? Didn't they have a national team in 1951? Yes and yes. They just hadn't attempted to qualify for anything until 1978. They hadn't joined AFC yet. It is remarkable how recently Saudi Arabia started to try to qualify for anything. And it was Saudi Arabia's first ever attempt to play in the Asian Cup in 1984 that announced them on the world stage as a real force. Because a golden generation for Saudi Arabia, led by superstar striker Majid Abdullah, won the Asian Cup the first time they tried. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, that was probably really easy. I mean, who was even in the Asian Cup in 1984? Well, South Korea's played in every Asian Cup ever held and hasn't won the Asian Cup since 1960. And they're pretty good. As for Majid Abdullah, the guy that led the Saudi golden generation, he was pretty good too. He averaged .97 goals per 90 over a 20-year career. 20 years from 1977 to 1997. That was in the Saudi League in all of its various forms, as we will continue to cover. He was called the Pele of the desert. He scored 189 goals for Al Nassr. Now, I don't think Ronaldo's catching that record. He was so important, his testimonial match was against Real Madrid, and Arjen Robben actually scored in that match. Just fun fact. Now, that Asian Cup win in 1984, less than 10 years after an actual national league was formed in Saudi Arabia, was just the beginning, because they got to 5, count them 5 consecutive finals in the Asian Cup, winning 3 Asian Cup titles. Now, as for the World Cup, it took a bit longer to break through, but eventually that golden generation carried Saudi Arabia to the world's biggest stage. In 1994, still less than 20 years after a national league was formed in Saudi Arabia, they made the World Cup. That was the US World Cup, and they made the knockouts immediately. And then they proceeded to make the next 3 World Cups as well, led by the goalkeeper who was named Asian Goalkeeper of the Century, Mohammed Abdulaziz Al Daya. Saudi Arabia's development was so explosive that it was still well ahead of countries like like mine, like the United States, blowing out the United States at the 1992 Confed Cup before losing to Argentina in the final. After those World Cup qualifying adjustments we talked about in the early 80s, the league kept changing. It actually rebanned foreign players in the mid-80s, only for those players to be allowed back in the early 1990s. In 1985, the top league added 2 more teams, going from 10 to 12, having done away with the 2-group playoff system, only to bring it back the next year because they split into 2 groups of 6 teams. If you finish top 2 in your group of 6 teams, you went into a final 4-team playoff. That ended quickly too, because by 1987 they were back to a fully points-based top league system with 12 teams. But they could just not give up on the playoff dream. And as an American, I have to respect it. And that's where something called the Golden Square comes in, which is a really fancy name for a very simple playoff. The idea was that the league would merge with the King's Cup, which had been getting played since 1957 in one way or another, and is essentially, again, the FA Cup of Saudi Arabia. It was to be combined with the league into one tournament called, and I have to make sure I get this right, the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques League Cup. Saudi Arabia is really not a fan of brevity. The idea is essentially a normal league where at the end of the season, the top 4 teams are broken out into a playoff, a home and away semifinal, and then a final decisive match for the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques League Cup. But as weird as it sounds, this was the most stable that the league structure in Saudi Arabia had ever been. From 1991 to 2007, they did the same thing every year. And it was during this time that the major cities of Riyadh and Jeddah asserted their dominance over the entire Saudi league system. Every title in this period was won by 4 clubs from those 2 cities: Al Hilal, Al Nasser, and Al Shabab from Riyadh, and Al Ittihad from Jeddah. Only 1 club from outside of these 2 major cities has won any version of the Saudi top league since 1987. Al Fateh from the city of Al Asa in 2013. So no matter the league structure or the existence of the Golden Square, the same clubs have been winning the dang thing. Obviously, the Saudi league is not alone in that either. But there's an interesting reason that these big clubs were able to maintain such an iron grip on the Saudi league, and that's because it wasn't fully professional. It was a semi-professional league with certain teams often using amateur level players, which meant the Saudi bureaucracy, which was supporting particular clubs as their personal fiefdoms, was able to pay players a ton of money relative to what other teams were able to pay those players. The league would actually not become fully professional until the Golden Square would end in 2007. That means that the Saudi league has been fully professional for just 15 seasons. And the only reason that happened was because of the Asian Football Confederation. You see, the Asian Football Confederation went around and required the top leagues of its countries to be fully professional. They also went around requiring at least 16 teams to be in the top league, and since Saudi Arabia only had 12 teams in its top league, this was a bit of a problem. So the Saudi government and the Saudi Football Federation decided to create a separate entity to run the top league, the Saudi Professional League Authority. This is similar to the way England does it, where the Premier League is a separate entity from the actual English Football League. This, through a bunch of leaguelese, bought them more time to slowly expand the top league to 16 teams, and it only reached 16 teams for the 2011 season. And when all of these changes happened, the King's Cup was once again split off from the top league, and in 2008 you had the Saudi Pro League and the King's Cup in place, and that is where we end up at our modern day structure. Well, not until 2011, then you had 16 teams, now there's 18 teams. It's always changing. But this was a professional league based off promotion and relegation, where now the bottom 3 teams get relegated to the first division. By 2011, for the first time, really, you had a recognizable 16-team top league system with this promotion and relegation, but with a foreign player limit. And that's how Saudi Arabia continued until the 2022 World Cup happened. The government clearly saw the impact and power that success on a global stage could bring. It also saw the interest from its own populace, with the Trt World Cup being essentially a home World Cup for them, considering that's Saudi Arabia and that's Qatar. And Saudi Arabia had already been taking part in what is called the Qatari model of development through sports. But Saudi resources, when dedicated to soccer or football, offered a chance to take things to a completely other level. After the World Cup, the PIF, or the Public Investment Fund of the Royal House of Saud, took control of 4 of the 5 big clubs in the Saudi League: Al Hilal, Al Nasser, Al Ittihad, and Al Ahly. The board of each club was to be made up of 5 public investment fund appointed members and then 2 members from nonprofit organizations. They also announced plans to go after hosting their own World Cup, which of course they got. Saudi Arabia is hosting the 2034 World Cup because, well, they managed to convince FIFA to give the World Cup in 2030 to 3 continents, meaning 4 of the 6 continents were unable to host the 2034 World Cup. It was just Asia and Oceania that could even bid. And when FIFA happened to announce that the bidding process for the 2034 World Cup would begin 3 years early, Saudi Arabia submitted its complete plan 65 minutes later. And that is all somehow an appetizer to the full power of the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund being put on display this past summer. It spent $1 billion in the transfer window. And that is before the player wages, which are astronomical relative to the value of the players being purchased. The foreign player limit was raised from 6 to 8 in the Saudi League just in time for the big spending, and the Saudi League's existence outside of financial fair play regulations means that a lot of the biggest clubs in the world in Europe are not really legally allowed to even attempt to compete with the level of spending Saudi Arabia is displaying. That means for the public investment fund, if the money or the project can speak to the player, they can have the player. There is quite literally no league or club that can compete with what the Saudi League is offering financially. It's not possible. But it's dragged Saudi Arabia into a much more public position than it's been in the minds of many in the past. Mohammed bin Salman, the public face of Saudi Arabia's ruling house, was interviewed and talked about the idea of sports washing away Saudi Arabia's human rights record, and he said that he's okay with it being called sports washing. His argument being that his only goal is to grow the GDP and the economy of his country. He cites that tourism has gone from 3% to 7% of the GDP since this big investment in sports, and that sports itself has gone from 0.4% to 1.5% of the GDP of Saudi Arabia in that time. What goes unsaid and unmentioned in those interviews is that human rights organizations like Amnesty International continue to condemn Mohammed bin Salman. Felix Jenkins of Amnesty said MBS's rule has been a truly dark time for human rights in Saudi Arabia. But one look into the stands at Newcastle United, which the PIF purchased 80% of as part of this massive spending spree, shows that organizations like Amnesty International can shout all they want. It just doesn't seem to matter as much as it maybe should. And while the Saudi League might get clowned for one-off low attendances on social media, the truth is the biggest clubs in Saudi Arabia are averaging well over 20,000 fans per match. And with a World Cup in line 11 years from now, that is likely to increase. But perhaps the most important part of all of this is the part that gets talked about the least. The entirety of what the PIF in Saudi Arabia is attempting to do is a very delicate balance. It is an absolute monarchy that works in tandem with particular strains of Islamic fundamentalism. This has complicated things because certain parts of the Islamic aristocracy have constantly condemned Western sports, like football or soccer. This is why the sport was banned until 1951, if you remember. But the other side of this delicate balance is a growing middle class that they're attempting to appease with a better economy and sport. And into that delicate balance, the PIF has thrown more than $1 billion in taking control of the top 4 clubs in the country. And what's going to happen as a result of that over the next decade is going to play out in an unusually public way and is going to be a hot topic of conversation in football and soccer circles for a very long time.